Hello, everyone. Coming from Asheville, North Carolina, I'm Christian Cooper, and I chose to write my research paper on the great missionary to Ecuador, Jim Elliot. I was drawn to this person for a few reasons, but first and foremost, it's because the church where I serve has a ministry partner in the jungle region of Ecuador, working amongst the same people group that Jim Elliot did for a few years, the Quechua people. In fact, I get to lead a few mission trips there every year, and so naturally, I was definitely excited about writing this paper. Jim Elliot, he was born in Portland, Oregon in 1927 during an interesting time in the history of Latin American missions. The lack of missional success in Latin America during the first 1800 years after Christ's death is really hard to grasp. It's estimated that there were only 50,000 evangelical Christians in all of Latin America in 1900. This minimal number can be attributed to a few factors, but first and foremost is because the Roman Catholic Church had a very strong foothold in the area, and the opposition toward evangelical Christians was pretty fierce, making missions very difficult, if not impossible, in the region. Also, Latin America kind of lacked missionary zeal because it lacked the quote unquote glamour of missions in Asia and Africa and the South Seas at the time. And then lastly, because many people viewed Latin America as already nominally Christian, so they didn't think that the area really needed to be reached. But the sad reality is that many people were Catholic in name only and didn't really understand what they believed in. But thankfully, during the 20th century and 21st century, Christians became very aware of the overall need for mission work, and numerous organizations were formed and sent lots and lots of missionaries to the area. Ironically, though, Jim Elliot's most notable endeavor was one that wasn't under the guidance of any one organization. Jim grew up in church from the time he was born, and his conversion came around the age of 6. Over the course of his life, his faith would deepen, and he would remain faithful to the call to follow Jesus for many years. Elliot eventually would go on to attend Wheaton College from 1945 to 1949, and it was here that he would begin to fully understand the Great Commission. He decided that the command to go therefore and make disciples of all nations was given directly to him. So he was very confident that God was leading him to give his life on the mission field, especially after taking a short-term mission trip to Mexico. However, he remained very patient on God to reveal the where that he would ultimately be sent. Eventually, through correspondence with a few different missionaries and some experiences he had, he was able to narrow it down to either India or South America. And after his graduation, he had a very important experience that would ultimately decide where it was that he would go. He attended Camp Wycliffe, which was a summer institute of linguistics that proved to be vital in his final decision. During this course, Jim was paired with a missionary, and that missionary just happened to be one to the Quechua Indians working in the Ecuadorian jungle. And this missionary was actually the first to ever tell Jim about the dreaded Warani or Aka Indians, who were virtually untouched by outside civilization, and a group in which supposedly no white man had ever made contact and survived. So naturally, knowing Jim's spirit and his passion, his interest was immediately piqued. He decided right off the bat to spend 10 days in prayer to secure an answer on whether God wanted him in Ecuador or not. The answer ultimately would be yes. Jim wrote in his journal, "I dare not stay home while the Quichuas perish." So he spent the next year and a half following Camp Wycliffe, preparing to leave for Ecuador, securing a passport, packing, learning Spanish. And during this time, most importantly, he connected with two friends by the name of Ed McCauley and Pete Fleming, who ultimately would decide to go with him to the field to Ecuador. So on February 4th, 1952, Jim and Pete left for Ecuador by boat. They were later going to be joined by Ed McCauley after he was married later that year, and then eventually Elizabeth Howard, who Jim would marry a year and a half later in Quito, Ecuador. Jim and Pete were going to take over a mission station in Shandia. Their job was to fill in for a missionary who was forced to leave because of his wife's illness. It was here that they would meet Nate Saint, another missionary who was a jungle pilot who had been doing mission work with his wife Marge in the area since 1948. The mission work settled in for them, and over the course of the next 3 years, they began teaching school, preaching, practicing basic medicine, and of course, conducting Bible training. They would work here for 3 years, and as they did, they heard more and more about the Auca Indians. They learned that everyone from Spanish conquistadors to Catholic priests to rubber hunters to oil drillers had all been the victims of Auca spears and had been killed. This only made Elliot and the men and their families more and more passionate to reach these people. The 5 men, now including another missionary by the name of Roger Yoderian, and their wives, were all eager to make some kind of contact with the Auca people. They had been praying for some time for an opportunity and a breakthrough, and one ultimately would come in the fall of 1955 when Nate Saint would discover an Auca village during a flight over the jungle. In response, the 5 families decided that this was the time, and they began planning and praying. And after a few weeks, they had devised a basic plan to make contact with the people. That plan was pretty simple. They decided that a regular program of gift drops made by airplane, made over a period of time, would eventually show the Indians that their intentions were good. So they began weekly airdrops starting in October of 1955. They dropped things like kettles, buttons, clothes, to salt, to axe heads, to machetes, all in the hopes that the Auca people would eventually grow fond of the men and their families. Eventually, as they hoped, the Indians showed signs of friendliness as they waved, as they looked forward to the drops, and eventually they even began sending gifts back up to the missionaries during the gift drops. So after about 10 airdrops, the men felt very comfortable and they decided to make plans for ground contact. January 3rd, 1956 would ultimately be their D-Day. The 5 men landed their plane on a riverbank near the Auca village. They slept in a treehouse 35 feet above the ground, and their basic plan was just to wait on the Indians to make contact with them. Luckily, they didn't have to wait very long. On Friday, January 6th, just 3 days after they arrived, that contact came. 3 Aucas, about 11 o'clock Friday morning, stepped out of the jungle, 2 women and 1 man. They spent the day with the 5 missionaries, trying to communicate despite a language barrier, trying to get to know each other. The man actually even took a flight with Nate Saint over his own village. So things seemed to go very smoothly, very well. The Indians were very friendly. They didn't seem very frightened, very concerned. And then eventually, later Friday evening, all 3 of the Aucas would make a peaceful goodbye and disappear back into the jungle. Now, once again, the men were just forced to sit around and wait. And on Saturday afternoon, Nate decided to make a flight over the village just to check on things, in which he immediately noticed that none of the men from the village were present that had been present before. So as he flew back to the camp, he saw those men making their way toward where the men had their treehouse. And so all of the men were very excited. They were looking forward to finally making some significant contact. So Nate Saint made his scheduled radio contact at 12:30 p.m. and promised to reach out to his wife again by radio at 4:30 p.m. Unfortunately, that contact was never made. Contact was not made through the rest of the night, Sunday night. And on Monday morning, another missionary pilot decided to fly over the site where he actually saw the missionary's plane that had been stripped of its fabric, and there was no sign of the men. So at this point, missionaries and government officials quickly organized a search party, and the story broke worldwide as Time and Life magazine came down to capture the story in person. After searching for a few days, on Friday, the search party identified the bodies of Jim, Pete, Roger, and Nate floating in the river with spears actually still stuck in their bodies. Ed McCauley's body had apparently washed away. It's very notable to think that Jim Elliot was only 28 years old on the day of his death. The public response was ultimately mixed, as some praised the dedication and sacrifice of the missionaries and their families, while others just simply saw it as nothing but a tragic waste of life. The trauma was obviously very immense for the wives of the men, even though they had prepared and they knew that death was ultimately a possibility from the start. What did seem clear, however, was that for all the commitment and sacrifice made by the 5 men and their families, it seemed like there was virtually nothing to show for it. No Aucas had been converted. No progress had been made. Thankfully, though, that would not ultimately end the case. God had a great plan in store. Amazingly, some of the wives remained in the area and continued to perform faithful missionary work in Ecuador. Other missionary pilots stepped up. They continued the airdrops. And after 2 more years of slow progress, Rachel Saint and Elizabeth Elliot were actually invited into the Auca village where they would live for the next 2 years. And now the work had truly begun. In the next 2 years, many of the Waorani tribe would ultimately become Christians, including some of the men who would actually kill Jim Elliot and his companions. The Bible would be translated into their language, and most of that area would eventually be won with the gospel. Jim's life, it proved not to be the tragic waste that many people first saw it as. Though he only lived to be 28 years old, his impact was immense. Not only were the Aucas reached, but his sacrifice triggered a greater awareness to Latin American missions, an area that had lain dormant for hundreds of years, and many men and women committed their lives to the field as a result, not just in Ecuador, not just in South America, but in all the world. And specifically, I'm thankful for Jim Elliot because of the work of him and the 5 others and their wives. Much of the Ecuadorian jungle is now open to ministry that I get to be a part of as a result. Jim had a famous quote that he penned in his journal at age 22. He wrote this. He said, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose." These words that would be penned by Elliot in ink would later be validated by his blood, and God would ultimately be glorified as a result.